Here I have Manu Samriti Chander, who is Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University of Newark. He holds an MFA from the University of Michigan and a PhD from Brown University. His first monograph, Brown Romantics, Poetry, and Nationalism in the Global 19th Century, examined the appropriation of British romantic tropes by colonial poets throughout the 19th century. He also has edited a collection of short fiction by the 19th century Guyanese author Egbert Martin, and co-edited with Tricia A. Matthew a special issue of European Romantic Review on generic experimentation in romantic abolitionist literature. Professor Chander is currently working on the collected works of Egbert Martin with support of a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Grant and developing a second monograph, Browntology, currently under contract with Student Press.
I went to Catholic school for elementary school. This was in the 80s. We did a unit on, religion was Christianity. We had religion every day, but then we did I think 2 weeks on other religions around the world. So they did when they did Hinduism, we were learning about caste, and there was me and the one other Indian kid in the class, and our teacher asked us, hey, so what caste are you? And the other kid was like, oh, we're Brahmin. And I had no idea. I can't remember. I think I was in maybe 5th grade. And so I had to go home and ask my parents and then report back the next day. So I asked my parents.
For credit, did you get points for this?
No, this is my participation grade. Right? And I remember thinking it was cool. We were Kshatriya, so warrior caste. And I remember thinking, at whatever age I was, 10, that it was cool to be warrior, even if we weren't as high up on the totem as the Brahmins. But later, the more I studied South Asian cultures, and the more I sort of got familiar with the history of caste oppression, I grew to become sort of really embarrassed about my name, Manu Samriti, which is the name of the laws of Manu, a sort of landmark text in the sort of establishment of caste hierarchy. I did work on in grad school on Dalit poetry movements, and presented at a conference, the annual South Asia conference in Madison. Presented on the Dalit Panthers. The person introducing me assumed I was Dalit and that my name was ironic, that I had been named as a sort of fuck you to.
That was like your stage name.
Yeah, totally. But even though it wasn't, I think it sort of spoke to a lot of the ways in which I actually do engage with. Not just me, I think a lot of us, Desis in America, engage with the question of Indianness, i.e. through irony, right? So always sort of half at a distance, and always conscious of the absurdity of brownness in America, right? The fact that your minority status is variously sort of a mark of inferiority, or a mark of superiority, or a mark of exoticism and wisdom, or of innate cartoonishness, that we have this this sort of variability that I think makes irony, laughter, cynicism even, but some kind of distance from racial identity, a sort of a necessity for us, I think, even a survival technique. Before I went into literature, I always wanted to be a poet since I was about 13. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with resisting the model minority myth that so many of us sort of grew up with. So I have my dad's a physician. He came over during the so-called brain drain. He came from Punjab in 1970. Both my sisters went into medicine. My oldest sister married an Indian doctor. And I think it was just about seeing the path that was laid out for me. Not, I mean, by family, of course, but they're being sort of symptomatic of a sort of broader culture in which brown folk play a prescribed role. Seeing that path and looking for some kind of alternative. So I threw myself into poetry. Actually, in the 19th century, in the moment that I study, as you get the rise of the novel, you see poets increasingly turning to that genre as a sign of sort of cultural resistance, or as a space of cultural resistance. I didn't know any of that at 13. I read Langston Hughes. I wrote a lot of poetry in all lowercase, and then occasionally with like lots of capitals thrown in for emphasis. But I was committed. So I went to college to do creative writing. I finished my degree at Wesleyan in 1999, technically, after a semester off. And did a creative writing thesis, went on to Michigan to do an MFA in creative writing. And the hilarious thing about all of this, really, I think, is that you being me, start by turning to poetry as a site of resisting your prescribed role, but then go on to Wesleyan and the University of Michigan and then Brown University, and then become a tenured professor, at a research institution. So the sort of culture of achievement was never, far from sort of ingrained in me, or far from. So I finished up at Wesleyan, I finished at Michigan, and I didn't know what to do next. I figured if I went to do more grad school, I would have plenty of time to write poems. I didn't really know what a PhD in English was, and I didn't know that I would never have time to write poems again. And so I went to Brown to study post-colonial poetry, which at the time was an understudied field. Jahan Ramazani's book, The Hybrid Muse, which was on post-colonial poetries, had just come out. And I saw that as really interesting because in my, study of Indian literature and post-colonial literature more generally, the novel had played such a dominant role. So I wanted to go, think about and read post-colonial poetry and then write my own stuff. And in the course of studying post-colonialism, I read Spivak's major work, the Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, and the first chapter where she talks about Kant. And so then I went and read Kant and focused on the text that she focuses on, the third critique. And that was the sort of gateway to 19th century studies, to the Romantic period. What I've learned about Romanticism is, in order to do it conventionally, or full-time conventionally, you have to, on some level, just really care about the writers that have been, held up as the sort of exemplary romantics. And I never did much. I liked Keats. I still like Keats. But I couldn't imagine devoting any more time to sort of serious writing about Keats and Wordsworth and Shelley and Byron. So I turned my attention to a different project called Brown Romantics, in which I looked at the ways in which romantic ideas and philosophies and politics and tropes and techniques were mobilized towards nationalist ends by 19th century writers in India and Australia and British Guyana. I finished Brown Romantics and then got tenure and was sort of at a crossroads in terms of what I wanted to do next. And I realized I was less committed to the romantics part of the first project than the Brown part of the first project. And so I wanted to take on this new project that I'm doing now called Browntology, which is working from the ontological turn in Black studies and sort of working through, what I'm thinking of as the condition of brownness.
We sort of went over that career of yours and kind of your trajectory over time and the various projects you've done, and bringing that forward to the current moment. And you're talking about what does it mean to be, well, a couple different things. This idea of what does it mean to be a brown body and as a solution to American racism. If I'm kind of phrasing. Mm-hmm. You had this phrase which I've been thinking about all week since. To be the knee on the neck of the Black man in America, right? Or the knee on America. And then you had this piece come out recently on LA Book Review of Books, which was looking at karma of brown folk from Vijay Prashad at 22.
Yeah. Have you read the book yet?
Yeah, I did a while ago.
Yeah.
Not totally sailing, but you have the general gist of it.
Yeah. It's one of those books that, as I talk about in that essay, was particularly important for me at a moment in my life when politics in general just wasn't on my radar, and at a moment when I couldn't quite see that an absence of political commitment, and particularly left political commitment, was a form of complicity in a culture of anti-Blackness within which South Asians had been used as a weapon against Black America. And that idea, the model minority thesis, is something that remains, I think, relevant today. We still have Dinesh D'Souza and figures who want to not only stay quiet about the model minority construction, but also who are thoroughly committed to it. So I wrote that piece about reading Karma of Brown Folk when it came out, I was 24, but I had been introduced to the title and the ideas in it when I was 22 by a visiting assistant professor at Wesleyan, Lisa Armstrong, who was Vijay Prashad's partner. And I had this moment of I don't know how you describe it. The phrase that I use in that essay is that I could feel like a gear or something grinding in my chest, like something tightened and happened. In terms of my coming to consciousness about brownness and the condition of brownness, which is not to say that all of a sudden I was thoroughly committed to left politics and went off to fight in the global revolution, as I talk about in the essay. And as we talked about before, I think in our last conversation, like I'm fairly successful on terms that have nothing to do with the liberation of darker peoples. I'm successful in an academia that has historically marginalized darker peoples, Black people specifically. I am successful on a set of terms that are established and sustained by, as I talk about in that essay, white supremacy. So what we get, what I encountered in writing that essay was a deep conflict between having an awareness of the ways in which my being, my place in American society is merely by virtue of my achieving that of being a weapon in the cause of anti-Blackness. You find your moments of resistance within a broader narrative of complicity. And I think of that specifically in terms of the story that I talk about in that essay, where the owner of the Indian restaurant in Minneapolis, after his building caught fire during the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, was watching the news, and his daughter heard him say, "Let my building burn. These people need justice. These cops need to be held responsible." And his daughter posted that to Facebook. And it's such a rich moment for me in ways that I didn't even get to fully cover in that essay.
That restaurant is also like such a loaded metaphor, because it's an Indian restaurant owned by a Bangladeshi American, and it's called Gandhi Mahal.
Right. It's already right. I mean, you sort of you couldn't script it in more sort of loaded terms. No, you're absolutely right. But also, there's something about the way it was presented. So he's posting to Facebook to thank his customers for their outpourings of support, and his daughter takes over the keyboard, it seems like, to say, "This is Ruhel's daughter, and I just heard my dad say this." And so there's a way in which that moment of resistance is one that even he doesn't really seem fully aware of, but that his daughter is able to see and to sort of use to ignite people. I mean, it's literally, I mean, the phrasing she uses is, "This fire burns in all of us," something like that, right? Like, light it up, to ignite people. And I think there's something about the generational moment there, right? I mean, it wasn't my generation. I'm 44, right? It wasn't my generation that came up with the hashtag "not your model minority." Right. If we had that hashtag when I was, 22, I would have been all over it. We didn't have Twitter, but there is a new brown left that's younger than me and younger than Vijay Prashad. There is a new brown left that that sort of reinforces for me a kind of hope that while at the individual level, our forms of resistance may be momentary, fleeting, "let my building burn," there's also hope of a broader collective push to refuse the model minority position and the sort of the structure of anti-Blackness in which many South Asians have historically been complicit.
Starting with this idea of being on these tracks that when we all immigrate, like one of the things I always kind of say, especially to a lot of like my students who are in a diaspora, and they always want to write about like that experience and like, "Oh, I grew up in this family and this is what I'm dealing with." And the thing I always have to say to them is, whenever you come or when your family comes, like they're kind of freezing that version of the homeland in like amber, right? It's like the Jurassic
Right.
Park thing of like, yeah, little mosquitoes like in that amber, and the little like DNA of the blood of the country is kind of like sitting in that mosquito, and that's the version you bring with you, and that's kind of what you grow up with, right? And I've kind of been unpacking that a lot in the past few years with myself, and sort of realizing that, you know, we sort of came in this narrative, or in this kind of track of, how many dollars did you say your dad came with?
8.
It was like 8. Okay.
Actually, the story, let me interrupt and then you come back. 8, but it was 775 actually, because at Heathrow he was so thirsty he stopped to buy a Coke.
Oh
so,
my God. What year was this?
1970.
Oh, okay, wow. Okay, so we came in 89, so they bumped that up to 40. And then I don't know, maybe Coke's still 25. But yeah, so, but that's like the thing. It's like, I always call it the proverbial 40, which I guess is not totally accurate. But yeah, everyone sort of thinks like they came with this much, but it's actually that everyone came with, and everyone is sort of living out this story. And the thing that I've been unpacking is that, you know, we sort of came in with this mindset, or I guess I should more fair to say I was raised with this mindset that I was within this kind of story of these quote unquote model minority kind of ways of immigration, of like these doctors and engineers. And my parents really weren't that. And it's sort of figuring out that I was in these spaces where I was kind of expected to be that, and that I never, like, the resources were never kind of really there. And I think that kind of is slowly evolving with this, what you're saying is like the new sort of brown left is a recognition of what that is, and how the systems work.
There's a whole other history of brown movement that doesn't at all fit the model minority framework, and Prashad touches on it in Karma of Brown Folk, but I think there's been more interesting, it's been more work, much of it interesting, on indentureship. I think of works like Shona Jackson's Creole indigeneity, and a whole sort of fleshing out of the narrative of sort of brown movement, and also importantly, doing it in a way that that decenters the United States, because you know, with indentureship, we're talking about the movement from South Asia to the Caribbean, right? I mean, to largely to the Caribbean. So we're talking about other forms of brown being, which were also used in certain ways to sort of to foster a sense of South Asians as hardworking and so on and so forth, but didn't have all the same sort of class codes built into it. And so my current work is on Browntology, is trying to think more generally about brown movement and diaspora as a as a condition that isn't restricted to understanding brownness in strictly American terms.
Well, it gets back to that like push-pull of like, how do you look after your own while looking after for your neighbor or your other?
It's about ethics. And it's about a broader commitment to responsibility. So I took when I was a graduate student, I took a year where I was affiliated with Columbia instead of Brown through this exchange they had, which I basically did. I mean, it's dissertation stage, so I wasn't taking classes anymore, but I did it so that I could live with my then fiance, who was at Columbia. And I took a seminar with, it was actually sort of a big lecture with Spivak, and a legal philosopher. It was team taught by the two of them. And Spivak said, raised this opposition that I had never actually thought about. It was my gap in reading. It's a commonly discussed opposition, but I had never encountered it before she brought it up, between rights and responsibilities. And it's interesting. I mean, basically, the short of it is, when you think of like the controversy around wearing a mask, right? It's all surrounded by, well, it's my right to not wear a mask, but you have a responsibility to wear it for the safety of other people, so on, right? And so there's a clash between rights and responsibilities. And I think about that a lot, because it's a very rich opposition. For one thing, it's potentially one that leads you towards conservative thinking, right? So you have a responsibility to country, you have a responsibility to race, you have a responsibility. So all those kinds of things can lead towards very troubling, a sort of troubling sort of politics. On the other hand, it also leads us toward the problem of ethics. So if we set aside rights for a moment, right? If we bracket the question of rights and focus on what is my responsibility, and you think of that responsibility as being one that is for those for whom there was never the possibility of making it, is impinged upon at the most fundamental level, which is to say, you can't make it if you can't breathe. You can't make it if you don't have clean drinking water, right? Ways in which the system is founded upon denying access to upward mobility to certain groups of people. The ethical obligation, which has nothing to do with rights, right? For brown folk, the karma of brown folk, right, is to those American comrades.
What does resistance look like as a scholar? Because you're mentioning that you're successful in this one way, and it's not kind of this prototypical in the street sort of like kind of position. But I mean, do you feel like there is a way to do that work, or what does that look like?
I do. I like everything else, I sort of oscillate between thinking the university just isn't the setting for it. I mean, there's critical work on the ways in which the university can sort of be politically productive and generative. You know, I take some inspiration from work like, you know, Moten and Harney's The Undercommons, and its central question of the intellectual who is in but not of the university. I have a particular set of political opportunities or possibilities available to me because of where I teach. So because I teach in Newark and because the vast majority of my students are brown and black, I'm positioned in such a way that I can leverage questions like identity politics and those kinds of issues that you were talking about before, right? The things that are interesting to various groups of my students, where I can leverage that towards discussions of broader inequities, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous, colonialism. There's more radical hope, or hope for a radical future, in thinking about the possibilities, the political and ethical possibilities of brownness, for me, than South Asianness. and trying to express why in my current book. So maybe when I'm done, we can chat again and see if I
Sure.
reached any answers.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. We'll have to blow it up and